This is the first of a three-part webinar series that's offered through the Oregon Data Project. And today, what we're going to really look closely at is that integration of the Common Core state standards and educator effectiveness within data use and PLCs and data teams. Denise Arola and I work together in putting these sessions on for you, and she just does a fabulous job with delivery. And so I know that you get to hear my voice often, and so hearing a message from another voice is really helpful. And so I'm going to turn things over to Denise at this time.
All right, and we're going to go ahead and get right into it because we just have this one short hour. And what we're going to focus on today, as Mickey mentioned, is establishing really that rationale for integrating initiatives and identify the content and processes from the Direct Access to Achievement project that support effective integration, particularly of Common Core state standards and educator effectiveness systems within the school. And we want to demonstrate how you can use a framework like Action Research to assist you in that integration. And this is a graphic that you may have seen at the most recent data retreat, but I think it's a powerful graphic. And I think about this a lot. This is something that applies everywhere from these large systems, the federal system, which I've been spending some time with lately, and our state education systems down to our regional district, even down to the classroom. When our efforts aren't integrated and aligned, how likely are we actually to see progress in the direction that we intend? Well, if you've got all of these forces acting in different directions, they're ultimately end up canceling each other out. And what you find is you see yourself entering into a new initiative feeling like you never got past the point that the prior initiative was supposed to take you to. And to get around that, we really need to think about a systems approach. How do these different initiatives, what are the elements of them, and how do they fit together, integrate into the educational system that we're a part of and trying to improve? And that likelihood of progress increases when we integrate those essential elements of those new initiatives, and we think about them more from a systems approach than an individual initiatives approach. I'm going to start just with a question, just to open it up, just to see where you guys think the field is at this point in time. To what extent do educators in your districts or school view Common Core state standards and educator effectiveness as mutually supportive elements of a comprehensive system geared to improving student outcomes? I'm going to open a poll and ask you to give us an idea so that we, as a group, so that we can learn together. Do you think that educators, for the most part, not at all, they don't view it as part of an integrated system? I've now opened the poll. Do they see it to some extent as part of an integrated system that supports the work of the other? More, they see it as integrated more than they don't, or they see it as integrated to a great extent? Let's get an idea from you all where you think the field is with this in your experience. And you'll notice, I believe I'm posting the time, so it'll give you, we've got up to a minute left to get our results in. So just a few more of you. It's a comprehensive system, to some extent, a little. It looks like we've got most of you finished and in. I think I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and show you the results. Now, hopefully you can see those results, but what basically it comes out to 67% of you say that the field, to some extent, sees these as a comprehensive system, elements of a comprehensive system that's ultimately going to improve student outcomes. And about 25% of you say that more of the educators you work with see this that way than don't see it that way, which is a really positive place to be to start out. So let me go ahead and clear that poll. I'm hoping you were able to see those results, and we'll move into our content. You know, how do we encourage integration and alignment of these initiatives rather than layering? Well, I would tell you that the data project, the Direct Access to Achievement project, over the course of the past 6 years has really created a platform that allows you to effectively and meaningfully integrate any new initiative because it focuses on some critical components that are foundational to what we do as educators. And I don't know of many other initiatives out there that have acted in this manner, that have acted in a way that allows you to really bring all of the pieces together and to support the creation and development and sustaining of high-performing teams to do the collaborative work that none of us really can do alone. So there are frameworks that we've learned about, and we're going to kind of flash back in time, look at the data project content that we've been exposed to or learned in the past. And you're probably familiar with these 4 critical questions that guide our work as educators. What do we want our students to learn? How will we know what students have learned? How do we respond when they don't learn? And how do we respond when they do learn? These 4 questions really are at the heart and shape the work that we do with data and should be how we think about the data that we need, the data that we use, and the way that we use it. In terms of what do we want students to learn, that's our connection to the standards, whether it's the state standards or we've moved into the Common Core standards that have been identified. And this is the information where we're determining at the district level those power standards and pacing, how are students intended to achieve the specifics at this grade level. And that's also where we think about how to connect those standards to specific learning targets, which also helps us to connect it to our assessments. Where do we see students going? What does it look like when they get there, and how will they get there? How can I best help them to get there? In terms of how will we know what students have learned, that's the data-driven, a big data-driven part of it. That's through monitoring those common formative assessments. That's the setting those SMART goals that are generally that 80-80, 80% of kids achieving 80% of mastery. The teacher assessment goals that are part of educator effectiveness. The analysis strategies that allow us to look at our instructional strategies and the tools and resources that support that. And just a quick, again, connection back to the content, those common formative assessments that you all use that are thermometers, that they're quick and painless. These are not summative assessments. They are more frequent, and they come from a variety of sources. They help us to teach, to assess whether or not kids are getting it and are able to then generalize it. They're quick checks. Sometimes it's a look at some item analysis and using common assessments that help us have a sense of where kids are. How do we respond when they don't learn? Again, that's part of that data team concept. It's getting together and figuring out who needs to work on what and what do they need. Is it intervention? Is it more practice so that they can take it from short-term memory into long-term so that it can become something that's fluid and fluent for them? Is it extension and enrichment so they can take it deeper and apply it in different contexts? And it's also where we look at who's most qualified to help students with these particular needs, and moving on into their, tier 3 intervention, that triple dip. And then also looking at what does the post-intervention data look like? And then finally, how do we respond when they do learn? Are we standards focused? Do we go deeper in the standard? Do we look at blooms and the depth of knowledge? Do we help kids to extend their thinking to deeper levels through these research projects and lab activities, individualized plans, and open-ended and student-designed learning? So that's kind of thinking back to, these are the critical questions that we're really about in this education work that we do. And in the data project over the years, we have continually come back to the data team process. What do we do in those collaborative teams? We look at collecting and charting data, analyzing those strengths and obstacles, establishing the goals that are not static. It's a cyclical process, so they're reviewed and they're revised over time. We look at instructional strategies And hopefully in our process, we're looking at instructional strategies that have some evidence that they are very likely to get the changes that we're looking for, the outcomes we're looking for with students, and we follow that up with determining results indicators, and then monitoring and evaluating those results. So a quick flashback over some of the real meat, the core learning of what has been part of the data Direct Access to Achievement project. And now I want to bring in a piece that we may not have talked about as recently as you did in your data retreats, and that's action research. How we can use this framework not just to answer the questions about student learning in and of themselves, but to help us see how this can integrate our work with Common Core standards implementation and also educator effectiveness. And remembering that action research is that proactive search for the factors that impact and improve teaching and learning. And it's that process where we develop hunches or hypotheses, guesses about the relationships between what adults do and what students do as a result of what adults do. It's really a process, this action research process, the deeper process. It takes that data step, those data team steps, and it takes them a little bit deeper, like the next layer inside an onion. And it helps to create a culture of inquiry so that you can build this inquiry mindset, the how, the why, the when, for whom is this working, under what conditions. So it's a process we can use not just for investigating the data for the answers, but also helping us to shape the questions so that as we get these new initiatives, we have a way to put them into the context that we're currently working in. And I want to take you a different way through this graphic of the action research process. And I want you to think through the next few steps that I'm going to work through with you, and think about the way that I'm capturing these elements and how it applies to the ways that you've worked within collaborative teams or supported collaborative teams. And I want to look first at these three elements. If you think about it, those first four questions, those are guiding questions that we keep coming back to that can help us really to observe more carefully what's going on in instruction in the classroom and what's going on in our teams. So thinking about those questions, what do we want our students to learn? So what am I seeing about what students are learning in the classroom? How will we know what students have learned? What am I seeing in terms of assessment? How do we respond when they don't learn? How are teams looking at their data and then responding to that by changing practice? And how do we respond when they do learn? How are we using that information to replicate successful practices and to extend those to other students? Well, we have that observation and question piece that works with that analysis. At the heart of action research, we're constantly analyzing our data for patterns, trends, and clues, and that leads us to a hypothesis. We don't just get a hunch based on nothing. It's really based on the data. And then based on that hypothesis and what we might know about evidence-based strategies, we come up with predictions. We really want to look at the prediction part of that process. And in that, we have to think about the cause data and the effect data. What are the adults going to do, and how will that impact the students? If I do this, then the students will respond in this way. So that's the prediction piece. Again, it goes back to analyzing the data, it goes back to analyzing the research, and then it takes us to that step where we test the hypothesis. You can't test a hypothesis without thinking through what are the adults going to do and how do we think it's going to impact the students. So these are very intertwined. The other part of this prediction and testing of the hypothesis is that we're using the data to help us understand what our expectations should be. So we're not making our prediction based on nothing. We're going back and we're making our prediction based on the data, and we're also testing our hypothesis based on what data we plan to analyze. We have to think about how to collect it. So that's another important piece. And then once we have that set, we do the gathering. We pre-post test, we look at multiple measures, we collect adult data, the cause data, and then once we have that, we bring it together for analysis, for explanation, and then that leads us to new questions and observations that we can then build on. So this is what, in statistics, we like to call an iterative process, a cycle that we work through. What does that look like in terms of implementation challenges? So let's think about the action research piece that we just talked through and the challenges that we have coming up with implementing Common Core state standards, or that we're currently engaged in, really, because most of us are at the process where teachers are all expected to be to some degree aligned with Common Core state standards. And some of the challenges we have are those learner development and learner differences. So setting appropriate goals that are aligned with what we expect through learner development, what we expect through the learning progressions, and what we expect for student growth. Also trying to align with content and application of that content. How do we know we're getting at that deeper thinking? And then planning the instructional strategies and assessment that also bring that alignment piece into place. Engaging students in that strategy, creating and selecting measures that assess students' learning and growth relative to the Common Core standards, and then analyzing that data to make meaning about student learning and progress and repeating the cycle. Well, as you can imagine, this is probably the longest that many of us get to go in any direct access to achievement project without getting some feedback from you guys. I promise you that I do have another poll coming up where I'm going to ask you to give us some feedback, but we did some changes that have that just a little bit different. Teachers and leaders are going to need structures that provide support to meet those challenges. So here's a poll question for you. I want you to think about the people that you work with, the people around you. For which of the following options do you believe teachers will need the most support when it comes to these Common Core learning, these challenges that we know we're going to come up with? And the choices, as I open the poll, are collecting evidence to determine students' learning needs for Common Core standards-based grade level curriculum. So will they need support in collecting evidence to determine what those needs are? Or will they need support determining students' learning needs based on the evidence? So taking that evidence and turning it into understanding. Will they need support in setting their SMART goals for improving student achievement based on the evidence so that they are measurable and achievable? Are they going to need more support setting student learning objectives or goals, or identifying, selecting, or creating formative measures to assess that learning? Where do you see teachers will need the most support in your near future? Take a moment to look at that. We've got about 43 seconds left to get your responses, so let's think through that. All right, we're down to about 25 seconds to get your answers in. All right, let me post those results so that you can see them. And interestingly enough, we do have a couple of areas where the bulk of you felt teachers were going to need a lot of support or more support. And those were 40% of you felt that teachers would need the most support in identifying, selecting, or creating formative measures to assess student learning and growth for Common Core-based curriculum. And I also see that as a huge need. The second piece to that was setting those SMART goals for improving student achievement based on that.
So Denise, this is Nikki. I just want to interject that we created a formative assessment training last year that's available. And so if teachers in your district need support in that area, please let us know and we'll come up with a design to provide that training for you.
Which is one of the things that I love about this project, because everything I've seen over the past years has been formatively assessed and responsive to the field's needs. And this is another case where the information that you give back during these webinars can really help the project leaders understand what are the continuing needs, and it's really, really useful information. So let's think about that. So we know they're going to need help with assessments. We know they're going to need help with setting those SMART goals. Action research and data teams together can help us have a place where that can happen that's part of the normal structure. And when you put these pieces together, action research and your data teams or PLCs or PLTs or whatever name you want to call collaborative teamwork, that's where you get a system for integration and implementation support. It's a natural fit. So let's connect and integrate a little bit here. If you think about collaborative teams, first of all, that's an ongoing piece of what Direct Access to Achievement has been building and supporting across the state. A statewide, as Mickey once said, the first vision of it was a statewide professional learning community. And you actually have that in Oregon, where you have individuals coming together locally, regionally, and statewide to figure out from the data what the next sets of needs are. And out of that have come structures to support collaborative teamwork, to support the use of data. So structures can provide you with those focused agendas and that inquiry process. And if you remember, if you haven't forgotten, there is a toolkit that you can use, a very useful tool that not all of us are, not all states provide for their teams to use. It allows you to schedule and track teams' process and outcomes. So teams that are emerging, teams that are developing, teams that are trying to really move from developing to sustaining continual growth. This toolkit for accountability gives you a process, and it gives you a platform that you can use to schedule and track the team's work, the team's process itself, and the outcomes of that process. And it also has analysis tools that are readily available. One of the thoughts that Mickey and I were sharing earlier was, you know, if you think about it, the interpersonal processes, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint really quickly. We've got the structures that are so important to team process, but we also have interpersonal processes. Those are the norms and roles for facilitating the inquiry process. These are really important pieces of effective collaborative teams. Well, you can use the toolkit for accountability to record the norms for the group. And one of the norms for the group might be making sure that people come to the meeting on time and having a set response when that doesn't happen. So you can have your norms recorded, have what happens, how the team will respond when the norms aren't followed, and all of that is down in writing. It's for reference, so the team can come back to that for reference. For example, if the team isn't coming prepared, one of your follow-ups to when people aren't following the norms is to set aside meeting time for preparation prior to having the meeting where you do the actual analysis. Sometimes that's a very motivating factor. And some of the teams I've worked with, they have some nonverbal cues. They have little pictures of Norm from Cheers, if you guys date people like me. But if you remember Norm from Cheers, they put his picture on a visual, and they just hold that up to remind people that we have norms about not speaking over each other or letting certain things be said without judgment. So a lot of different ways that you can record that information in the toolkit and have that for future reference, and then look at your process over time. In addition to how you can use collaborative teams that we can connect and integrate through these teams, we also have those procedures, those analysis tools, and action research is among those. And it helps teachers use data and evidence to reflect on the challenges, successes, and resources that they bring to specific instructional tasks or situations. So how do you support teams in doing this? I was looking through the materials that have been developed by the project over this time, and it's amazing what's been done. The implementation rubric and the team observation tool are phenomenal pieces that have really captured some of the discussion over the years about how do you really help people implement, because that is where Rick Hess, who is he's an educational person that is quoted quite a bit in the opinion op-ed reports, was talking about how it's not that we have a lot of initiatives that are failures, it's that we fail in the implementation. And the implementation rubric and the team observation tool are both critical pieces that can help avoid that situation. So if you look at this, on the left is the implementation rubric, which in the most recent data retreat, you were exposed to the problem solving and data analysis portion of the rubric. On the bottom right is a picture of the observation tool. And we're just going to look at these so that you can have an opportunity to see what these two pieces can bring to integrating this action research project into what you're doing with Common Core implementation and educator effectiveness implementation. So the implementation rubric has implementation areas. These 6 areas are leadership, problem solving through data analysis, curriculum and instruction, assessment, positive school climate, and family and community partnering. And what's neat about this is you have examples, very specific examples, like any rubric would have, about what each of these different implementation area looks like. If you're an emerging in the process, if you're developing and building the infrastructure, if you're operationalizing and trying to gain consistency. And the 4th area is if you're optimizing, if your use of this is getting to the point where you're innovating and sustaining it. And those indicators there are indicators that group these descriptors in the rubric by structures. So what provides help with structures? What does it look like for processes and procedures? And what does it look like if you're doing this with professional development? So one example here would be if we're thinking about Common Core state standards implementation, and we're concerned about how we're able to integrate that so that what's going on with the data project, what's going on with Common Core, what's going on with assessment, and what's going on with educator effectiveness kind of all fit together into one piece, then you can look in the curriculum and in the assessment portion, and you can find some of these indicators. So, for example, under operationalizing and under processes and procedures, the school leadership works collaboratively with school staff to reflect upon and improve the staff's use of instructional strategies. And there are monitoring tools that are adjusted as needed, and goals and timelines are for reaching certain levels of fidelity are agreed upon and followed. So that's if you're at the operationalizing stage. So it really gives you a sense of what it might look like. The other tool that's available to help with this integration is the team observation tool. And it has the team steps, and it has very specific indicators of what it looks like when it's proficient and what it looks like for exemplary in terms of the behaviors within the team. And it talks about agenda and minutes, norms and participation, data organization and analysis, etc. The observation tool, a really good suggestion for the use of the observation tool would be to have your teams self-assess using the tool. Figure out if they're proficient, exemplary, or not, if they don't even come close to proficient, or how many of the proficient behaviors they actually have going on. So they do a self-assessment, then they have a process observer come in and do an assessment of the team. And then they sit down with the process observer as a team and compare the self-assessment to the outside assessment, and then set goals for how the team can grow, and then actually set timelines to meet those goals. So again, you've got this fantastic tool that can help you get there. So let's look at a very specific example of how this could work. And what I focused on here is an example in the implementation areas of problem solving through data analysis, curriculum and instruction, and assessment. Because again, these pieces kind of all flow together. They're not intended to be separate, but it just helps you to see the elements that comprise it. So in action research, the observation and question step, I have a team here that's from a junior high, and they've been given a task. There are multiple grade levels. Their task has been to look at whether or not the alignment of the texts that they're using, whether those are in their textbooks or reading passages that they take from other primary and secondary sources, their science reading texts, whether or not the complexity of those texts that are used at each of those grade levels are aligned with the expectations for complexity that are specified in Common Core State Standards. That's a really important piece of integrating the information and the efforts. So you have a team, and that's their charge. And the first thing that they do is they kind of observe and come up with some questions. Do the recent assessment data reflect that the students are able to comprehend text that's written on grade level, appropriate level of complexity? So you start with looking at what data you already have and whether or not kids are comprehending when they're given a complexity level that's appropriate for their grade. And in this case, the team found out that 45% of their students were comprehending at that level. They also assessed the different readings that they were assigning and using. And what they found was the teachers had anywhere from 35% of their readings to 75% of the readings that were at an appropriate complexity level for their grade level. They also discovered that the students that this was mostly applying to was the pre-advanced placement and the honor students. They tended to not only get the more complex readings, but they also had a higher percent of students comprehending those. And the other question they were asking was, under what conditions do we really see this occurring? Based on that data, that information, those initial observations and the questions that those generated, they hypothesized and predicted. So they said, if we increase the text or readings of sufficient complexity so that at least 60% of what we're giving them for their assignments, regardless of pre-AP or honors enrollment, whatever class they're in, if we increase that to 60% and we scaffold the students who need support, then our students will improve their ability to comprehend the complex text aligned to grade level. So if we just stop there, we've got a prediction, but we don't have a prediction that's easy to measure or that's easy to assess whether or not, we've achieved it. So that's where a SMART goal comes in. So they set a SMART goal for improvement that was expected, and they said, in terms of the outcomes, we want 57% of our students to demonstrate proficiency with grade level science comprehension on a post-assessment reading task as compared to the 45% that demonstrated this on the pre-assessment. So they had a goal for the students, and then they had actually something they could measure for the teachers, which was having at least 60% of all the assignments have that level of appropriate complexity. So then they went about testing this hypothesis. So the grade level teams assessed their text-based and other reading source selections for their curriculum units, and then they made sure that they had a plan for getting at least 60% at the right level. They decided on instructional strategies and supports for their students and a time frame for post-assessment. And they recorded all of this so that the next time they came together, they knew what was expected. If between those times, they had those expectations recorded so that in the life of our insanity, as we work, we know we always have to come. If we don't write it down, we don't remember it. So teams decide on the indicators that will help them know whether they implemented with fidelity, and then they implemented those planned actions. And then they gathered the data. The teachers monitored their implementation, and they administered and scored the student post-assessment. At the end, they were able to look at that data and analyze it. Did the students improve on their scores in terms of comprehension on the post-assessment? And they asked this question in terms of who improved, who didn't, to what extent. Do those questions sound familiar, like the questions we talked about at the very beginning? And was that improvement or lack of improvement associated with certain conditions? If they hadn't collected the adult data, they wouldn't be able to answer that last question there. So then the team looks at that information, and based on what they find, they determine new questions or clarifications, and then they start the process all over again. So it's a continuous cycle. It's a feedback loop, so to speak. That's what we can think of when we think of action research. That's a connection to Common Core State Standards. let's turn our hats just a little bit to connecting to educator effectiveness. The evaluation and professional growth cycle supports an inquiry mindset as well. Evaluation and professional growth cycle have self-reflection, they have goal setting, they have observation, collection of evidence, they have formative assessment and evaluation, and they have summative assessment. If you take a look at those pieces and then take a look at the action research graphic, you can see those interconnections. And how does that connect more directly to educator effectiveness? So as we're going through this, I'd like you to think about that inquiry mindset, and I want to give you some very specific examples of these connections, and then I'm going to have another polling question for you after this slide that's going to build on, it's going to reflect on what we're going to talk about right here. So how does action research connect to educator effectiveness standards? Under the educational leadership and administrator standards, there are numerous areas. You need to have inclusive practice, ethical leadership, socio-political context. There are areas that are directly connected to what we just talked about in action research. Visionary leadership, creating a clear vision and commitment to these inquiry processes that use data, to the processes that you're learning for these collaborative teaming pieces. That's part of visionary leadership. Instructional improvement. How do you know what needs improvement if you're not collecting data and you don't have a system, processes, and procedures that feed data into the professional development planning process? Again, another connection. These are connections that are directly described in the implementation rubric. So you can see how the data project work can allow you to integrate. So if I'm a leader and I'm worried about my evaluation, if I'm implementing these processes, if my evaluation is going to take care of itself, I'm going to be building the things that it takes to be able to show evidence of how I'm doing and meeting these standards. If you think about instructional improvement, that's all through the implementation rubric itself. And then the final piece, effective management. If you think about leaders having to commit to the resources, time, and energy it takes to support collaborative teams, you've got another connection of how you can use this for integration. On the teacher side, you know, there's professional responsibility, and teachers are going to be setting goals around professional responsibility, professional learning, ethical practice and leadership, and collaboration. But they're also going to be setting goals around the learner and learning, and around content, and around instructional practice. And when you look at this, and you look at the implementation rubric, you can see that using these process tools and these frameworks like action research, if teachers are doing this through their collaborative teams, that they're going to be building the artifacts and evidence to support their own effectiveness and improve their own effectiveness in these particular areas. So given those two connections to educator evaluation, whether you're a leader or whether you're a teacher, I'd like you to think through this next question. For which of the following do you believe leaders will need the most support? And I'm going to go ahead and post this as a poll. And let's read through the examples together so that you can, and then I'll open the poll. Will they need support collecting evidence to determine teachers' needs for professional practice? Will they need help, the most support in determining teachers' needs for improvement based on evidence? Will they need the most support in setting teacher goals for improving professional practice based on the evidence of teachers' needs? Or D, identifying, selecting, or approving formative measures to assess student learning and growth for teacher goal setting? Or E, setting appropriate teacher goals for student learning and growth? So this is a complex set of tasks that leaders are going to be involved in. Let's open the poll. It gives you 1 minute and 30 seconds. But where do you see the most, that leaders will need the most support as they integrate the work of educator effectiveness and support Common Core State Standards implementation. Let's take a look at that. So we have about 6 of you that haven't had a chance to answer yet, and we've got 40 seconds left in the poll. We're collecting some great data here. All right, we're down to 20 seconds. Very interesting set of results. And I am going to go ahead and close the poll and post the results so that you can see. Interestingly enough, nobody selected collecting the evidence to determine teachers' needs. Pretty much we feel that leaders are going to be comfortable with that. But look at how spread out this is. This is a very flat distribution. Statistically, that means that we're in a lot of different places. There's a wide range of leaders' needs out there that you're anticipating, which means that we really need to think through how can we provide those supports for them. 27% said that setting teacher goals for improving professional practice based on evidence of teachers' needs. Boy, is that is a tough one, and I'm actually hearing that a lot from the leaders in my state, that being able to set very specific SMART goals around how much improvement do we need to see is something that they are not comfortable with at all. And they want a lot of examples and they want a lot of practice at it. Second to that really are 3 areas, 20%, determining teachers' needs for improvement based on the evidence, not just our intuition or our perception of a particular person. Identifying, selecting, or approving formative measures to assess student learning and growth. Again, how are we going to allow, what are we going to allow teachers to use to show student learning and growth? And then setting appropriate teacher goals so that we can say students have, what we expect in the amount of student learning and growth. Those are tough areas. So this is an important question to think very deeply about, because these are the areas that as you are supporting educator effectiveness and trying to integrate these different pieces, it's just important information for all of us to be considering. So that takes us to thinking about leaders and how they can use action research for a framework for instructional improvement, and while also using it as a framework to help implement Common Core State Standards. So if you think about it, that action research process can, as teams and leaders become more comfortable as they move from emerging and developing into the higher areas in terms of implementation, where they're operationalizing and optimizing, they're going to be gaining more practice opportunities to flexibly help teachers set goals for professional responsibilities, for professional practice, and in particular for student learning and growth. It's difficult to do that if you're not already collecting data and don't already have a sense of the student landscape. This is where pre- and post-assessment becomes so very critical, helping to make sure that teachers and teams are looking at these data so that this is not something new and suddenly it's part of a high stakes. It needs to be something that they become very fluent and almost subconsciously are able to do it unconsciously. It's part of their long-term and working memory, this using evidence to establish goals for student learning and growth. The analogy that I heard today, that was perfect, was, if you think about it, how many times have you been in your car and you're driving along and you intended to go in one direction, but you've taken 2 turns and find that you've automatically gone in a different direction? And you think to yourself, who was driving the car today? Was it the me that was going where I intended, or some part of me that's got this automatic routine for driving? We want teachers and leaders to become so fluent with this collaborative data process through action research, through the data team process, that they can fluidly and fluently look at what they're seeing in terms of the evidence of student learning and growth and set good and appropriate SMART goals for teachers to work towards. The second part of that is identifying, creating, and selecting the formative measures to assess student learning and growth. If I have to start this, or if I have to think about this only from the perspective of evaluation, that's really high stakes, and that makes me as a teacher very nervous. But if I'm starting already with a process that's ongoing, if my school is already involved with collaborative teams and I'm looking at relevant student learning data, then I'm already building artifacts and I'm already using a process that allows me to collect good evidence and shows my response to the evidence, particularly when I'm collecting really good adult cause data. Makes it even stronger in terms of being able to demonstrate that I've got that connection as a teacher between what I'm doing and and how that impacts what the students are able to do and to demonstrate. So this gets me to a point where I really thought this was going to take us a lot longer to work through. So I do want to open it up for group reflection now from you guys, whether it's reflecting back to the areas where you believe teachers are going to need the most support, or the areas where you believe leaders are going to need the most support. Let me go back to those slides. I'll go back to the teacher slide first. And I'd like to just get some feedback from you guys based on what, just getting some specifics to follow up on this. So we talked about for which of the following do you believe teachers will need the most support, and by and large we had 2 areas, and it was setting the SMART goals and identifying selecting or creating the formative measures. So I would love to hear from you all why these 2 pieces are the biggest challenge, and what you think could help you to get further along with that. If you haven't had a chance yet to look at the rubric, that's going to be one of my suggestions. So let's go ahead and hear what you have to say in terms of where you believe teachers will need the most support. I know if you need to unmute, there you go, please unmute yourself. And you can do that in the participant piece, in the participant window.
Well, I had to do that twice. Once when he was out in the snow all night and he didn't come home when I thought he was, so I was worried about him. And I think once when his dad was dying. So, yeah. He doesn't matter, I do not pay attention because I know how to get to him. So, so let me ask that question tonight when he gets in and see kind of what his plan is for the rest of the week. Because I know he when we walk back there one night, he wants to do this because he's found the rock. I just don't know if it will be timely for Friday night.
All right. Do we have?
Sounds like there's a little multitasking going on out there, and so I was trying to be helpful by unmuting folks, and obviously that may not be the best strategy. So my apologies.
So let's take a look. Does anybody have any feedback in terms of what they're doing in terms of the areas where teachers need the most support, or the areas where leaders need the most support? Things that you think are needed, or just your response to where you feel that maybe this action research process, taking a look at it from the integration perspective, might be helpful. And to participate, you simply go to where the audio is and unmute yourself. There's a little microphone that has a slash through it that you can hit to mute or unmute yourself in the participant window. And that participant window is available at the very top of your screen. There's a little toolbar that if you mouse over the top, near the top of your screen, in the middle of the top of your screen, you should see the toolbar, and it'll have participants, and then within participants, you can unmute yourself.
So Denise, I have a suggestion. Perhaps we could go to the project website and look at Strand 5, which is the content for supporting teachers in creating those formative measures.
Okay, hang on just a moment. Let me pull out of here and open a page and go to.
Great, so now go to instructional.
All right.
And then if you go to Strand 5, click here.
Got it.
Okay, so we rolled this out last winter. We ran a pilot of this particular training session, and it was a two-part series. And folks left with an assignment, and when they came back with those assignments, it was very impressive, the work that they had accomplished in a 4-week period of time. And so you are free to use this content if you feel that you have the backgrounds and skills to provide the training and support within your district and or region. But if you do need some support, know that project staff, which are all volunteers with the exception of myself, can get creative in identifying ways to support you.
And you can see there's a good set of resources here, as well as formative assessment, template worksheets for each of the grade levels. A lot of good information that's been developed, as usual, through the project. And the agenda gives you a sense of what's covered through that particular training. And that's a big help for that area in terms of supporting teachers and helping them to create those formative assessments. What about supporting leaders? And this is something that with educator effectiveness, one of the, I feel like it's unique, at least it's unique to me, in that Oregon created an educator evaluation system that allows teams of teachers to work to set a set of goals together, which I think is phenomenal because it, again, supports this notion of effective collaborative teams as one of the primary ways that you can really make a difference for students. What are leaders, you know, we've got that split in terms of support. What are some of the things you're thinking about there in terms of what leaders are going to need? What are some of the specific, maybe some experiences that you've had that have kind of helped you to see why you answered the way you answered? And there's also the chat if you're not able to participate with audio, which is sometimes the case. If you put something in chat, then we can read it out loud and share it with the group. Is that Penny trying to talk? I see your icon has popped up.
Well, I think what I might do, as folks are either thinking and or maybe a little reluctant to jump in there, is that I think I'm going to share the poll information with COSA and have conversation with them about what is it that we could do to, first of all, collect more information, because I'd be curious from a bigger group of participants to hear what they feel is the need, and then based on that, start the conversation about how we can provide support to leaders in our state in filling some of those gap areas.
And I do have from Penny that she found during the sessions at the data retreat that administrators have a difficult time knowing what formative assessment should look like. We've struggled with this as well. And it isn't just the teachers that struggle with it, it's the leaders. And so if you have both groups not really sure what formative assessment should look like so that you can really understand how kids are doing as they go along, then that's an area that is really helpful. And I understand that sometimes audio doesn't work, so Penny has just sent that one in. Others found a similar problem with administrators not really understanding formative assessment and what it should look like. Again, this is where the Strand 5 materials could be really helpful for administrators, maybe tailoring some of that toward helping administrators develop an awareness of what that should look like. I think an area, as some of you are looking at perhaps typing in, an area of concern for me has been also helping administrators and teachers understand how to bring multiple pieces of evidence together to represent the data that they're using to base their decisions on. We've had situations where SMART goals are being written off of a single set of data as opposed to either, and that data, sometimes that information isn't as reliable. And the best way to increase the reliability of what you think you're trying to, what a student's issues are, or a group of students' issues are, is to gather more data in terms of other multiple measures, other sources of information. And that's that connection. If you're thinking about multiple measures, then you're building those artifacts that you could then bring to an assessment goal setting session under the educator evaluation system. So that's a really important piece too. I find that teachers and administrators alike struggle with what constitutes multiple measures, particularly if they don't say exactly the same thing. And talking through that, having them have opportunity to talk through that in a formative or summative evaluation conference can be very difficult if they haven't had practice talking through that in their collaborative teams. So that's, again, a place where building in opportunities for people to bring multiple sources of data together and talk through, particularly when it doesn't always line up, that's a really important experience for teachers and leaders to have.
There's an interesting point also made in the chat about the need to really help educate parents. At this time, we put a lot of weight on summative assessment, but how students perform on those formative measures really help us understand what their performance will be on those summative measures. And so finding ways to help parents see those connections and understand that. And I think that in looking at proficiency grading, that will help in making parents more informed and better understanding those connections between student performance and that link to what their test behavior ends up being. But it's a really good point that we need to also educate our parents.
Mm-hmm.
And another really sound consideration that came through in the chat is that really helping teachers and administrators understand that formative assessments can be formal or informal, and that the informal ones really need to be more frequent and can be responded to more immediately. is a really good point. So there are a lot of embedded considerations within formative assessment that we need to draw out, as well as just be more intentional about. Denise, it is 4:30.
Oh.
And so if you can go back to that summary slide.
That's correct.
Thank you all for your contributions and for your time.
Yes, we've definitely looked at action research as a procedure and a framework that we can use if we can embed it into the work of the data teams and PLCs. You know, ultimately the idea is to increase our effectiveness and reduce the exhaustion we all feel from trying to implement a variety of initiatives at the same time. And it's also a way that can help you ensure that your efforts are actually making a difference, having an impact. Finally, there's 2 future webinars, Making It Stick, going from training to implementation practice. So how do you help people go from what they're learning in training to actually doing it in practice, and what does that look like? And then that's in February, on February 26th. And then the final one is what difference is this making? We'll take a careful look at just some good structure for evaluating program effectiveness and the fidelity of implementation. Just some simple ways to think about it so that you have some guidelines for how to do that in a variety of situations. So those are the pieces that are going to be coming up.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.